understanding, well, how much faith should we put in ICE, given its, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, given its new decision to basically study itself and to announce a whole set of reforms for immigrant detention. And so what I'd like to do is, to kind of get us to merge a lot of different themes here. And so I won't go through every slide, but I pass these out to everyone, but I wanted to give you kind of a way to contact me, as well as our website, which is www.aclug.org, to get a copy of the presentation. But I think the big thing that drove me to present today is we have to start asking questions. Why are we treating immigrants in detention the way that we are? We've already heard from our first speaker about the patchwork that we have in existence in the United States, which is arguably the largest immigrant detention center system in the world. Basically, on any given day, there are about 350 facilities that ICE can contract with at any given time, with over 32,000 detention beds on any given day. It's a patchwork of contracts with local counties and jail facilities, with what are called, with various direct contracts with private contractors that have what are called, contract detention facilities, as well as several facilities, 7 nationally, that the government directly manages right now. And as Adelina pointed out, ICE removals, ICE removals, are rapidly approaching 400,000 persons in any given year. And that, the total number of, individuals that have been placed in detention has only been increasing dramatically, just 23% within the last fiscal year. Who is in detention? Well, detainees include primarily men. The vast majority are men, but they include women, children, and in some cases, entire families. And, as Brian mentioned, CCA had actually had a contract in Texas that used to house entire families, but they have decided to not close, but they've stopped detaining families, but now they are a facility devoted to the detention of women, but it is still run by CCA. So basically, this huge number of individuals that are detained, nationally, as well as the fact that, actually, let me sort of just make sure that we kind of review just briefly kind of the facilities in Georgia. The largest one by far is the Stewart Detention Center, which is in Lumpkin, Georgia, which is 5.5 hours round trip, right from Atlanta. It's averaging a population count now, according to FOIA requests, of over 1,800 men that are detained in that facility. All of them are essentially detainees awaiting deportation. The Atlanta Pretrial Detention Center is another major one in and around Atlanta that has approximately 250 detainee beds. What's interesting about that facility is that it's a mixed one, and what that means is that it's one of these county jails that has both criminal detainees as well as immigrant detainees, and that causes a lot of issues because the standards for the detention of both of those populations are supposed to be distinct. But in reality, most of the standards that are used that have been designed by the government to treat for the detention of immigrants report, the SURE report. And if you're curious, the full report is actually available online. If you Google the SURE report, you should be able to find it. But basically, they've acknowledged that 89%. I mean, these are statistics all from their own report. But 89% of the detainees in custody, even though by our laws and statutes, are subject to what's called mandatory detention, which essentially means that you have some type of crime that would essentially in your past that could be extremely minor in many cases. I mean, we're talking misdemeanors, but even misdemeanors can be classified under immigration law as aggravated felonies, which would subject you to this particular statute, the mandatory detention statute. So ICE has recognized that the laws that we have don't essentially work because, you end up mandatorily detaining people in immigrant detention, but then the overwhelming majority of those individuals, 89%, have never committed any violent crime, right? So this is to kind of give you a sense of the things that ICE itself has recognized recently. That essentially, ICE also acknowledged that the majority of people, for example, like CCA, that are running these various detention centers and participating in them, are essentially former law enforcement personnel that don't really understand the unique population that's in immigrant detention. That the overwhelming majority of detainees nationally predominantly are from either Mexico or from Central American nations, and that raises a lot of interesting policy questions, right, in terms of migration policy and sort of how we've set up our immigration and trade laws, for example. And so the vast majority come from that region and that are detained in the United States. And despite all of this, you know, this is one thing we'll talk about later. I mean, ICE has a tremendous degree of discretion for who it chooses to prosecute, who they choose to take into custody. However, by all accounts, ICE is not using this discretion in a consistent manner across jurisdictions in the United States. The Atlanta jurisdiction, for example, is notorious for not even releasing asylum seekers who have passed what's called a credible fear review. So they arrive at the airport, they basically are determined by our government to have a credible fear of returning to their home country, and yet they still get placed into detention. You know, we have, for example, people that pass credible fear that end up in detention in Atlanta. Individuals who are picked up for minor driving violations, but because of Georgia laws, they end up going into detention as well, you know, as Adelina had mentioned. So there is always discretion on the part of ICE to look at various humanitarian factors to decide whether or not someone should even be prosecuted for an immigration violation. And they have the option of placing people or paroling people or giving them bond out of detention. But yeah, I think I had a statistic there. This is almost never used. You know, nationally speaking, there are only 51,000 spots for people that have been actually released from detention via bond, parole, or order of supervision. But this is really a policy decision on the part of ICE, and that's something that I think is important for us to be aware of. And Atlanta ranks very high. I mean, this kind of surprised everyone in the report, but they actually rank third nationally in terms of the number of arrests that result in detention, as well as detention capacity. So, you know, basically, ICE has, basically acknowledged all of these things, and now they're trying to figure out a way to make detention less penal, right, and more